It was an ordinary Wednesday morning in the small-town courthouse. Judge William Hartley, an experienced judge with a reputation for being stern but fair, sat behind the polished wooden bench, reviewing the list of cases for the day. The courtroom was a familiar space to him, a place where he had presided over hundreds of cases with a steady hand. He prided himself on efficiency. To him, the courtroom was a system. People came, decisions were made, and life moved on. But as he glanced at the list, one name caught his attention. Claire Johnson. He muttered to himself, scanning the file. A traffic violation, the kind of case he processed daily. He saw no need for much deliberation. After all, in his mind, there was little to question. The paperwork was in order, the fine straightforward. It was routine, and the kind of case that could be handled with minimal thought. He shuffled the papers, preparing to start the day. The door to the courtroom creaked open, and in walked Claire Johnson. She was dressed in a professional, smart outfit, black dress slacks, and a light blue blouse. But it was the calmness of her demeanor that caught Hartley's attention. She didn't seem nervous, which was unusual for someone standing before a judge, especially in a case as mundane as a traffic violation. Claire met his gaze as she approached the stand, her posture poised and confident, her dark hair neatly pulled back. "Ms. Johnson," Judge Hartley said, his voice steady, "you're here for a traffic violation. Do you understand the charge against you?" "Yes, Your Honor," Claire replied, her voice calm, yet firm. She didn't seem anxious about the process. Hartley couldn't help but admire her composure. Most people who stood before him seemed on edge, even if the offense was minor. Claire's ease made her stand out. She was different from the usual faces that came through his courtroom. The case was straightforward. Claire had been caught speeding on a local road, a violation that had led to her being pulled over by the police. The fine was $200, and Hartley was ready to move forward. He'd made up his mind already. There was no need to waste time. "Ms. Johnson, I'm fining you $200 for the infraction," he said matter-of-factly, as if the decision was no more important than reading off the time. "Please pay the fine by the end of the week." Claire nodded silently, accepting the ruling with quiet grace. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her words polite but lacking any trace of surprise or emotion. There was no protest, no visible frustration. She simply turned and walked out of the courtroom as calmly as she had entered. Judge Hartley sat back in his chair and glanced at the next case on the docket. The moment felt like just another in a long line of cases, and yet something about Claire Johnson lingered in his mind, even as the next defendant walked up to the stand. Her calmness, her presence, it felt different. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he felt that today might not be as routine as it seemed. Weeks passed after the traffic violation case, and Judge Hartley's routine returned to normal. He moved through his days with the same methodical precision that had defined his career. His mornings began with coffee at his desk, his afternoons spent presiding over cases, and his evenings filled with the quiet hum of paperwork. Yet, despite the comfort of his routine, something about that case with Claire Johnson still lingered in his thoughts. He couldn't shake the image of her calm demeanor, the way she seemed unaffected by the fine he had handed down so easily. But life went on, and Hartley pushed it to the back of his mind. Then one afternoon, while sorting through his mail, a letter caught his eye. It was an invitation to a federal judicial training seminar. Hartley was familiar with these seminars. They were designed for judges like him to stay updated on legal reforms, to hone their skills, and to learn best practices for fair and just rulings. He had attended them in the past, and though they were often long and tedious, he knew the value of staying current in the ever-evolving landscape of law. As he opened the envelope, the name on the letterhead made him pause. Federal Legislative Reform and Judicial Education Program. It was an esteemed program, one that featured top experts in the field of legal practice. His eyes scanned the list of facilitators, and suddenly, his gaze stopped at one name, Claire Johnson. Claire Johnson, Hartley muttered under his breath, his heart skipping a beat. He couldn't believe his eyes. The same woman who had stood before him in his courtroom just a few weeks earlier, the woman who had accepted her fine with such poise, was now listed as the lead trainer for this prestigious federal seminar. It didn't make sense. She had appeared to be just an ordinary defendant, someone who had made a simple mistake. Yet here she was, an expert in judicial training, poised to lead a seminar for some of the country's most respected judges. He quickly glanced at the details. The seminar would be held in a week at a conference center in the city, focused on judicial practices, racial biases in the legal system, and legislative reforms. It was clear this was no ordinary seminar. Claire wasn't just any trainer. Her expertise was being recognized at the federal level. Curiosity gnawed at Hartley. How had someone with such a commanding presence, such depth of knowledge, ended up in his courtroom for a minor traffic case? What had he missed about her? With a reluctant sigh, Hartley set the invitation down. He was both intrigued and unsettled. This was more than a mere coincidence. He had no choice but to attend. If Claire Johnson could teach other judges, perhaps there was something he could learn from her too. And so, without fully understanding why, Hartley marked his calendar and confirmed his attendance, eager to see what the next chapter would bring. What could this unexpected encounter between him and Claire possibly lead to? He had no idea yet, but something told him that his life was about to change in ways he never anticipated. The day of the seminar arrived, and Judge Hartley found himself at the conference center, surrounded by fellow judges from across the state. The room buzzed with conversation as legal professionals gathered, discussing new developments in the law and judicial practices. Hartley, ever the professional, slipped into a seat at the back, eager to observe but not particularly expecting to learn anything groundbreaking. He had attended many such events over the years, each one blending into the next. As the seminar began, a hush fell over the room. The facilitator, a tall woman with an air of quiet authority, stepped up to the podium. Hartley's breath caught in his throat as he saw her for the first time up close. Claire Johnson. She was dressed in a sharp black suit, her dark hair neatly styled. But it was the way she carried herself that truly stood out. There was an undeniable presence in her demeanor, a confidence that made everyone in the room pay attention. This was no ordinary trainer. She exuded a level of expertise and wisdom that immediately commanded respect. Claire began her presentation with ease, speaking to the room with clarity and depth. Her topic, the intersection of racial bias and judicial decision-making. Hartley listened intently, though part of his mind still grappled with the fact that the woman speaking so authoritatively had been a defendant in his courtroom just weeks earlier. How could the same person stand before him now, teaching him and his colleagues about fairness and legal reforms? As Claire spoke about the importance of understanding unconscious biases in the courtroom, Hartley couldn't help but feel a pang of discomfort. She didn't mince words, describing how small, seemingly insignificant judgments could build up over time, shaping the way justice was meted out. She spoke of how certain individuals, particularly those from marginalized communities, often faced a system that wasn't as impartial as it should be. Hartley's mind wandered back to his decision to fine Claire for a minor traffic violation. Had his ruling been a result of bias? He had made that decision without much thought, assuming it was just another routine case. It was impossible to ignore the connection between Claire's words and his own actions. As much as he had prided himself on being fair, something about her message struck a chord with him. Was he truly as impartial as he believed, or had his years on the bench made him blind to the subtleties that shaped the lives of those who came before him? During a break, the room filled with murmurs, and Hartley found himself lost in thought. He couldn't tear his gaze away from Claire, who stood in a group, engaging in conversation with several other judges. She seemed so at ease, so composed, as if teaching and advocating for justice was second nature to her. He noticed the respect she commanded from the others in the room. No one took her expertise lightly. Hartley's mind raced. He needed to know more about her, but he had no idea how to approach the situation. Should he bring up the case? Would she remember him? Could he even ask her about it without feeling like a fool? The questions swirled in his head, but he had little time to dwell on them. The seminar was about to resume, and for the first time in a long while, Hartley was eager to learn. But this time, the lesson wasn't just about legal practices. It was about understanding the deeper, often uncomfortable, truths about himself. As the seminar continued, Judge Hartley found himself more and more captivated by Claire's presentation. Her expertise was undeniable, and the way she spoke about judicial biases and the need for reform was both insightful and deeply personal. Claire wasn't just lecturing about legal theory. She was sharing real-life experiences, the kind that resonated with anyone who had ever worked within the justice system. Her words carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Hartley couldn't help but feel a growing sense of discomfort, as if every word she spoke was subtly challenging him to reflect on his own actions, his own decisions. During a break between sessions, Hartley found himself standing near the coffee table, his mind still processing the ideas Claire had introduced. He hadn't expected to feel so unsettled, but here he was, questioning everything he thought he knew about fairness and justice. The room was filled with chatter, but it felt distant, like he was in a bubble. He took a sip of coffee, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Claire, who was engaged in conversation with a few other judges. He hesitated for a moment, uncertain whether he should approach her. What would he say? How could he even begin to explain the situation? He had fined her. He had judged her in a matter of minutes, without giving her case the full consideration it deserved. How could he face her now, knowing that she was teaching him about the very biases he may have unknowingly displayed in his courtroom? After a few moments of internal conflict, Hartley made his decision. He walked over to Claire, who looked up as he approached. The conversation around her seemed to fade into the background as she smiled and greeted him warmly. "Judge Hartley," she said, her tone friendly but professional. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Ms. Johnson," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I didn't expect to see you here either. Actually, I wanted to speak with you." Claire raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Hartley took a deep breath, trying to figure out how to phrase what he was feeling. He paused, then decided to be direct. "I'm the judge who fined you in that traffic case a few weeks ago." Claire's expression shifted slightly, but she didn't seem taken aback. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully. "I remember," she said. "I was hoping we might cross paths here." Hartley's face flushed with embarrassment. "I just wanted to say that. Well, I've been thinking about it since. About your case, and about what you've been talking about here. Your words, they've made me question a lot of things, especially how I make decisions in the courtroom." Claire's eyes softened, and she regarded him for a moment before responding. "It's not easy to confront those questions, but it's necessary. We all have biases, even if we don't realize it. The key is being willing to learn and grow." Hartley felt a weight lift off his shoulders. There was no anger, no judgment in her response, just an understanding that made him feel seen in a way he hadn't expected. She wasn't condemning him for his past actions. Instead, she was offering him the opportunity to change. "I'd like to learn more," Hartley admitted, "about what you're teaching here, about how to be a better judge. I don't want to continue making the same mistakes without understanding why they happen." Claire smiled warmly. "I'm glad to hear that. It's a long road, but it's one worth walking. We can talk more after the session if you'd like." As Hartley nodded in agreement, he realized something profound. This moment, this conversation, was the beginning of a transformation, not just in his career, but in how he saw the world. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face the uncomfortable truths that had been hidden just beneath the surface. And he knew that Claire, the woman he had once judged too quickly, would be there to help him along the way. As the seminar continued over the next few days, Judge Hartley found himself caught in a whirlwind of introspection. His conversations with Claire during the breaks were becoming more frequent, and each one left him with more questions about his own judicial practices. She was patient with him, offering insights without judgment, encouraging him to think critically about his decisions and the broader implications of those decisions in the courtroom. But it wasn't just Claire's expertise that was having an impact on Hartley. It was the quiet realization that many of the biases and assumptions he had carried with him had been operating under the surface for years. One evening, after the day's sessions had ended, Hartley found himself alone in his hotel room, reviewing the seminar notes. He couldn't focus on the legal theories or the new practices they had discussed. His mind kept drifting back to the cases he had presided over in the past. He thought about Claire, how calm and composed she had been when he found her, and how quickly he had made that decision. How often had he made similar snap judgments in the past, assuming that the details of each case were as clear-cut as they seemed? Had he, in his desire to be efficient, been blind to the deeper complexities at play? His mind wandered back to that day in the courtroom. He remembered how he had barely glanced at Claire's file before issuing the fine. The paperwork was straightforward, and her case seemed unremarkable. Just another speeding violation to add to the docket. But now, looking back, he wondered if he had been too quick to dismiss her as just another case number. Did he see her as an individual, or did he see her only through the lens of the law? Narrow, rigid, without room for nuance. Hartley's thoughts turned to other cases he had handled over the years. How many times had he made decisions without considering the full story? How many people had walked away from his courtroom, possibly unaware that their fate had been shaped by biases he hadn't even realized he was carrying? It was a sobering thought, one that made his stomach turn. But as uncomfortable as these reflections were, Hartley knew they were necessary. It was clear that he couldn't continue in the same way. If he truly wanted to be a fair and impartial judge, he had to confront these blind spots head-on. He had to learn how to listen more deeply to the stories of those who came before him, to consider the context, and to challenge the assumptions that shaped his decisions. The next morning, after a fitful night of reflection, Hartley arrived early for the seminar. As the other judges trickled in, he sought out Claire. When he found her, she was deep in conversation with another facilitator, but she broke away when she saw him approach. "Good morning, Judge Hartley," she greeted him warmly. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice steady but filled with a new resolve, "about what you said the other day, about biases, and about how I make decisions in the courtroom." Claire raised an eyebrow, clearly interested. "And I want to change," Hartley said, his words coming more easily now. "I want to be better. I don't want to make assumptions about people based on how they look or where they're from. I want to understand the full story before I make a decision." Claire smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "That's the first step, Judge. The fact that you're willing to acknowledge it is huge. It's not easy, but you're on the right path." For the first time in a long while, Hartley felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't going to be an overnight transformation, he knew that. But he was beginning to understand that real justice didn't come from rigid rules alone. It came from the ability to see people for who they were, to listen with empathy, and to be willing to grow and learn. And in that moment, with Claire's encouragement, Hartley was more determined than ever to take the next step in his journey toward becoming the judge he had always hoped to be. As the seminar drew to a close, Judge Hartley felt a growing sense of clarity. His conversations with Claire had continued to challenge him. But more than that, they had opened his eyes to a broader view of justice. What began as an internal struggle, confronting his biases and acknowledging his shortcomings, had evolved into a deep commitment to becoming a more conscientious judge. He no longer saw the law as a set of impersonal rules to be enforced. He saw it as a living, breathing system, one that could and should reflect the complexities of human lives. Claire had spoken often about the importance of restorative justice, a concept that focused on healing and rehabilitation rather than punishment. It had initially seemed abstract to Hartley, who had always relied on the traditional system of fines, jail time, and legal retribution. But over the course of the seminar, the idea began to take root. What if there was more to justice than just the sentence? What if there was a way to understand the root causes of criminal behavior and address them in a way that benefited both the individual and society? On the final day of the seminar, Claire invited all the attendees to participate in a mock trial. The exercise was meant to test their understanding of restorative justice principles and how to implement them in their own courts. Each participant was assigned a role: defendant, prosecutor, victim, or judge. Hartley, feeling more open than he had in years, volunteered to take on the role of the judge in the mock trial. It was his opportunity to put into practice some of the ideas Claire had discussed, and he was eager to see how he would handle the situation. The mock trial was unlike anything Hartley had experienced. The defendant, a young woman who had stolen a car, stood before him. But this time, Hartley didn't see just a criminal. He saw a person who had made a poor decision, but who was clearly in need of support. The victim, a community leader whose car had been stolen, expressed more concern for the young woman's future than for the damage to his property. The prosecutor, however, was more focused on the crime itself, pushing for the maximum penalty. As Hartley listened to each side, he felt a deep sense of unease. The traditional response would have been simple: convict the young woman, impose a fine or jail sentence, and move on. But Claire's words echoed in his mind. Justice is not just about punishing. It's about understanding, about reconciliation. He paused for a moment, taking in the full picture. Then, for the first time in his career, Hartley made a decision that surprised everyone in the room. Rather than handing down a strict sentence, he ordered the defendant to participate in a restorative justice program, a chance to work directly with the victim and the community to repair the harm caused. He also recommended counseling for the young woman to address the underlying issues that led to her actions. As the exercise concluded, Claire approached him with a smile, her eyes full of approval. "That was brave, Judge. You saw the bigger picture." Hartley's heart raced with a mix of pride and uncertainty. He had stepped out of his comfort zone and made a decision that felt right, not because it followed the letter of the law, but because it addressed the deeper truth of the situation. As the seminar wrapped up, Hartley felt like a different person. The transformation wasn't complete, but it had begun. He still had much to learn, but for the first time in years, he was truly eager to continue his journey, not just as a judge, but as someone who could look beyond the surface, someone who could deliver justice that was thoughtful, compassionate, and fair. And as he looked at Claire, he realized that her guidance had set him on a path he never expected to take, but one that would make all the difference in the world. Several months passed after the seminar, and Judge Hartley returned to his courtroom with a new sense of purpose. The lessons he had learned from Claire, as well as the concepts of restorative justice and bias awareness, had reshaped his approach to the bench. At first, he was cautious, unsure of how to implement the changes he had adopted. But over time, his confidence grew, and so did his resolve to see each case through a more empathetic lens. One day, a case came across his desk that would put his newfound principles to the test. A young man, Jamal Harris, had been arrested for theft. He was caught stealing food from a local store, and while the crime seemed minor, it was his third arrest in just 6 months. Jamal, only 19 years old, had a criminal record that included petty theft, assault, and vandalism. His mother had appeared in court several times, desperate to get him the help he needed but unsure of where to turn. The young man was quickly becoming a fixture in Hartley's courtroom, and this time, it was clear that he was facing a harsh sentence. As Hartley sat in his chambers reading through the case, he felt a familiar stir in his gut. His old instincts screamed at him to just hand down a tough penalty, to send Jamal to jail, as he had done in the past for similar offenders. But something inside him pushed against that automatic response. He thought about the many conversations he had had with Claire, how she had emphasized that a person's actions were often the result of deeper struggles: poverty, trauma, lack of opportunity. Had Jamal's past led him down a path of poor decisions? What if there was more to this case than simply punishing him? As he prepared for the hearing, Hartley couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to Jamal's story. When the young man entered the courtroom, Hartley looked at him closely. Jamal's eyes were tired and vacant, as though he had resigned himself to a life of mistakes. There was no defiance in his posture, no sign of the rebellious youth that Hartley had often encountered in cases like this. Instead, Jamal seemed worn down by life, as if he had been fighting a battle that no one else could see. "Mr. Harris," Hartley began, his voice steady, "I've reviewed your case, and it's clear this is not your first encounter with the law." Jamal shifted uncomfortably in the defendant's chair. "No, Your Honor. I know. I just don't know what else to do." Hartley paused. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had seen so many young people like Jamal come and go through his courtroom. People who had been punished over and over again, only to return unchanged. But now, with everything he had learned about restorative justice and the need for true understanding, Hartley realized something. Punishment alone wouldn't fix what was broken in Jamal's life. "I'm not going to send you to jail today," Hartley said, surprising even himself. "But you are going to get help. You're going to attend a rehabilitation program that focuses on life skills, emotional well-being, and job training. You'll also meet with a mentor who can guide you through these challenges." The courtroom was silent as Jamal looked up, disbelief written across his face. "You mean I won't go to jail?" "No," Hartley replied. "But you will have to prove to this court that you're ready to make a change. This is your chance, Mr. Harris. If you take it, we'll all be here to support you. But if you don't, we will revisit this." As Jamal nodded, a glimmer of hope flashed in his eyes. Hartley knew this wasn't a perfect solution, and he couldn't guarantee success, but he was certain that a sentence of compassion and opportunity was a better path than simply locking Jamal away in a cell. As the proceedings wrapped up and Jamal left the courtroom, Hartley felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was the kind of justice he had been striving for, one that acknowledged a person's humanity and provided the tools for growth. It was a risk, no doubt, but it was a risk worth taking. And as Hartley looked at the case file before him, he couldn't help but wonder how many other people he had misjudged over the years, how many lives he could have changed if he had just looked a little deeper, as Claire had taught him to do. For the first time, Hartley was beginning to see the power of second chances, not just for those who came before him, but for himself as well. He wasn't just a judge now. He was a part of a system that could heal, if given the chance, and he was ready to be a part of that change. Months passed, and Judge Hartley continued to navigate the challenges of his evolving role. Jamal Harris, the young man he had sent to the rehabilitation program, was a case that stayed with him. As the weeks went by, Jamal attended the program and began to show signs of progress. He found a part-time job, attended counseling, and slowly started to build relationships with mentors who encouraged him to take responsibility for his actions. It wasn't easy, and there were setbacks along the way. But Jamal's transformation became a tangible reminder of the power of second chances. Hartley watched Jamal's case closely, attending his progress hearings and seeing the positive change in the young man. Jamal's mother also attended many of the hearings, her face filled with hope as she saw her son slowly turning his life around. There was a sense of pride in her eyes that Hartley had rarely seen from families caught in the cycle of crime and punishment. For the first time, Hartley realized that this was the kind of justice that made a difference, not just in the courtroom, but in the community. As Jamal continued to turn his life around, Hartley found himself re-examining the way he approached other cases. He started asking questions he hadn't asked before. Why did this person commit the crime? What factors led them to make this choice? Was there a way to address the root causes of their behavior rather than just the symptoms? Each case became an opportunity for growth, not only for the defendant, but for Hartley as well. He realized that his role as a judge wasn't just to hand down sentences. It was to understand, to empathize, and to help those who came before him rebuild their lives. One afternoon, as Hartley sat in his chambers, reviewing another case, he received an unexpected email. It was from Claire Johnson, the federal legislative trainer who had opened his eyes to the deeper aspects of justice. She had heard about his work with restorative justice and was impressed by the strides he had made in his approach to the law. She invited him to speak at a conference she was organizing for judges across the country, a chance for him to share his experiences and the lessons he had learned from their time together. At first, Hartley hesitated. The idea of speaking at a national conference felt daunting, and he wasn't sure if he was qualified to offer advice to other judges. But then he remembered the impact Claire had made on his life, the way her guidance had inspired him to question his assumptions and become a better judge. Maybe, just maybe, he had something worth sharing. He accepted her invitation. As the conference approached, Hartley spent time reflecting on his journey, how much he had learned, not just about the law, but about himself. He thought about Jamal, about the young people he had once dismissed as lost causes, and how those same people were now finding their way back into society with the right support. He thought about the judges he had once considered his peers, and how many of them were still trapped in the old ways of thinking, enforcing punishment without understanding the deeper stories behind each case. When the day of the conference arrived, Hartley took the stage with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. The room was full of judges, many of whom had decades of experience. But as he began to speak about his journey, the challenges he had faced in transforming his approach to justice, the lessons he had learned from Claire, and the difference restorative justice could make, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just about his growth, it was about the growth of the entire legal system. The audience listened intently, and as Hartley concluded his speech, he realized something profound. The journey was far from over. Every case, every decision, and every conversation was part of a larger movement, a movement toward a justice system that was fair, compassionate, and truly just. Hartley had come a long way since his encounter with Claire in the courtroom, but he knew that the real work had just begun. The path ahead would be long, but he was ready to continue walking it, not just as a judge, but as a catalyst for change in the system he had once believed was flawless. And for the first time in years, he felt confident in his ability to make a real difference.